Namaste and welcome to the Global Order. I'm your host, Swareena Singh. And today we have the fortunate pleasure of being joined by Dr. Gautam Sen, a renowned political economist and academic who has taught international political economy at the London School of Economics. Dr. Sen has spoken to Global Order many times before, and this conversation comes at a significant point given that the British polity and economy is in turmoil, the peak of it being Prime Minister Karmar's announcement of resignation, the sixth such announcement in the last decade alone. Dr. Sen, we are delighted to be joined by you. Welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me again.
Thank you, sir. I would like to start the conversation by requesting you to please help us trace back that what is it that we actually mean when we say that Britain is becoming poorer? Is the problem economic, political, institutional? If we can set a tone for our viewers to understand.
I'm afraid it is something of a death spiral. It is descending into some sort of economic endgame, and the political, institutional, and especially the moral order are apparently failing as well. So the situation is very serious, and all the pomp of royalty, etc., is not going to be sufficient to distract.
So when we talk about such a failure, the economic endgame, as you've called it, could we speak about how is it and what is it that hollowed out the economy, given also the context that in the last decade, since 2016 and since Brexit, the way there has been political instability, there has been economic instability, which I think goes way back, further back than the Brexit. But can we trace that a little bit for a general understanding?
Well, I think I'm glad you asked that question, because most people are not attentive towards the historical background. And I'm delighted, given the kind of work I used to do, to refer to that briefly, because it's a very long story. You see, Britain had the disadvantage of being the first industrial nation in the 18th century, which meant that its economic structure and institutional structure was market-driven. It was not guided by thoughtful policy. Now, this proved consequential because the latecomer countries, and especially Germany and the United States, seeing Britain's example, embarked on a much more structured plan for the economy, an organizational plan. Now, that was an original disadvantage the British never overcame, that the others had structure and guidance which they had learned in the 19th century. That is a backdrop. The second issue, which I think people underestimate, Britain became the financial center of the world and remained so really up to 1914, after which the two successive world wars bankrupted Britain, and by the end of the Second World War, they had lost their global economic footprint very substantially. They were deeply in debt. And I might say, as an aside, in order to resolve the huge debt they had, particularly the Lend-Lease debt owed to the United States, they cheated newly independent India of a third of its sterling reserves by devaluing. And Nehru swallowed it. One third. This was actually all the accumulated debt to India during the war, for which India was supplying goods for which they were not being paid. So they basically stole that by devaluing. And it's actually, in current values, $18 billion in my calculation, $18 billion in current values. Quite a lot of money. Anyway, the financial center status as a disadvantage, which people should think more about, which is a lot of money flowing into your country, which you're managing for a whole range of things. You're an intermediary, but in the process, your exchange rate gets overvalued. If you have lots of capital coming into an economy, the exchange rate will rise. And in my opinion, Britain has regularly had an overvalued exchange rate, which put its industry at a disadvantage. And there's an example which confirms this problem in a very serious way. When the European Union created the euro, they fixed their currencies to a particular level with each other. Individual countries lost the ability to use the exchange rate to adapt and adjust their economy, say if they had inflation, which of course was also supposed to be controlled, but it's never quite so simple when you actually try to do it. So what happened for the European countries who were in the euro bloc, Germany grew faster. Their productivity grew at 2% per year faster. So all the other countries were lagging behind, particularly countries like Italy and Greece, and the others too, which means they could not compete with German prices, which normally they would have adapted by devaluing their exchange rate, which they could no longer do. So the exchange rate is a big deal. And in my view, the British always had an overvalued exchange rate, which disadvantaged its industry. They grew somewhat in the 50s and 60s, but not in any spectacular way. In a way, this growth was catching up with the post-war decline, the destruction of the war. In a way, it was a bit of a catching up. There was a lot of unfinished work to be done, a lot of repair. So up to then in the 1970s, when it slowed down, it suffered the blow which everybody did with the oil price rise. And the other problem in Britain surfaced with a vengeance, which is class warfare. British trade unions really did not like how the society was run, and there were a lot of strikes, rubbish piled up. Things were very bad. I was here, so I saw. And this trade union strife, in a way, contributes to economic decline because you lose output, you lose productivity, there's disarray, and you cannot coordinate the economy without the cooperation of your working population. And this was very difficult in Britain. And then let's jump forward very quickly. As a result of all this, Margaret Thatcher came to power angrily in response to all this trade union trouble. And I even remember the names of some of these very formidable trade union leaders like Jack Jones of the Transport and General Workers Union, and very importantly, the leader of the Miners Union, Arthur Scargill. And Margaret Thatcher took it upon herself to smash them. She deployed force and the police, and she broke the miners. So that was the outcome. Anyway, but she did something else with Ronald Reagan, which is actually to monetize. There was financial liberalization in 1979. And financial liberalization, in a way, the financialization of the economy, in a way, laid the groundwork for a worsening of the situation. Because finance came to dominate over industry. Whereas a country like Germany was run by engineers, Britain has always been run by economists and accountants. And that has not been a good thing for Britain. Anyway, let's go fast forward to the time of Tony Blair, late 90s, 20s, and Britain grew. And I'm reading at a very healthy pace. Actually, it was only 2% per year. But they look back at a kind of golden age. That is not true. I think careful analysis will show they were creating problems for the future. And that happened with the big bang, with the financial crisis of 2008. In Gordon Brown, Chancellor Gordon Brown's deregulation of banking and the involvement of British insurance in the international financial scandal meant that the economy had collapsed. Now we can come right to the present. After that, nothing very much has moved forward. British living standards between 2008 to 2026 has, for the first time in history, remained stagnant. There's been no growth in living standards. And if I may, as an aside, quickly point out, in my view, all the prime ministers have been very mediocre. They have been poor leaders who coasted along, dealt with problems as they arose. They had no vision. The least incompetent was actually Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak was actually much more familiar with the nature of the problem. What he could not do was to embark on big structural change without the support of the general population. That was difficult and remains difficult, as it has been for a very long time. In between, two big things happened. One was Brexit. Brexit was sold to the people of Britain by a man called Boris Johnson, whose boss, very distinguished historian and editor of the Sunday Times, said of him that this man is totally unsuitable. His historian boss said of him, because he worked for him in Brussels as correspondent of the Times, Sunday Times. And this man, a very distinguished historian, denounced him as being totally unsuitable, and he was proved 100% right. Basically, what happened, he used this populist resentment against the European Union to win a vote. Very small margin of victory. The vote to leave the European Union was I think, just over 1%. That has proved to be catastrophic, as many people have told them it was catastrophic. Let me just reel out some figures so we don't have to dwell too long. The annual loss in revenue from Brexit has been 90 to 100 billion pounds. That's a big number. Because the new government, which came into power in 24, said, oh, we are short of 25 billion that the Tory party didn't declare as a shortfall. But the loss per year was almost 100 billion pounds because of Brexit. So you can see the magnitude of this. 100 billion is a lot of money in the UK. It's virtually the entire health service. In addition, the economy took a really monumental hit. The loss of GDP was between 6 and 8%, according to multiple studies, including one by Stanford. 6 to 8% is a big number to lose in your GDP. Private investment annually fell from 16 to 18%, a big number. Uncertainty, loss of European markets, and productivity fell by 3%, 3% more unemployment. So a lot of problems came together and they grew, and in between COVID hit. And this was a coup de grace, that everything that could go wrong was going wrong. And I'm afraid now where they are at is their debt ratio is 100. And the servicing of that is about 5%, a little bit more than 5%. Now, this means you have to devote 5% of your GDP effectively to service your debt, just to pay the interest on the treasury bonds. That means you're taking 5% out of current consumption, 100% GDP, out of that 5% taken away from people in taxes to simply service the debt. It's not like you're growing by 6% so you can devote the growth part to servicing. 5% is a big number now, unfortunately. It means people have been very badly squeezed, because 5% means that the mortgages of people have basically tripled. And I just learned that myself from something I own, that basically that meant a tripling of your payments. So if you were paying 250, you would end up paying about 725, 700. Now that means the consumer has suffered a big setback. What does a consumer do when they have this kind of setback, loss of income? They curtail spending. They have to curtail spending. So what they curtail is discretionary spending. They pay for the things they can't avoid, like rent, heating, hot water. But even that, people are living in the cold rather than spend on heating. Now, the heating bills have also tripled in this country. Water bills have doubled. So ordinary people have taken multiple hits, which means their consumption capacity is lower, which means people are not buying. If you go down many high streets, particularly outside London or in the outskirts of London, many, many high streets, shop after shop has closed. And this is very hard to recover from. And then the last thing that has cropped up for the first time in history, the welfare bill, that is pensions, health, unemployment has exceeded all income tax. The welfare bill is higher than all income tax at about 331 billion pounds. So there is no money in the kitty to do anything else. That's all your money gone. It's slightly ahead, and it's historically significant. It never happened before. Now people are very upset because they know a slice of this is going to look after migrants who are coming across the English Channel in boats. 300, 500, 700 a day. They are being put up in 3-star, 4-star hotels. Their food catered for. They're being given SIM cards for their phone. They're taking them out on fun days to make sure they're okay. So it becomes an attraction for people. And the French government is very happy for them to leave the French soil from the other side of the channel and come to Britain. And if you ask them why you come, he said, life is good over here for a refugee. See? And they can't or won't do anything about it. This is a burden and people are very upset. So this is the bind they're in. They signed a treaty with India very eagerly. It's not been ratified by the British Parliament yet, so yet not operational. They think it might save them because India is growing. And the reason the Indian treaty became very important is because they found they could not become more integrated with China, which they would really prefer to, because the Americans won't accept it. Because Britain is basically an American vassal. They don't really go against the Americans. So the Americans have told them China is no-go. So they have shifted to India. They're trying to revive some kind of trade relationship with Europe. All the ongoing discussion. That would be a sensible thing to do, because the cost of leaving Europe has been phenomenal, and Mr. Boris Johnson. But the irony of all this is the person considered the most popular politician today is the man who led this from outside, Nigel Farage of the Reform Party. He was the one who was the most keen to leave Europe. Yet, his party has lost an important recent election in a place called Makerfield in North England, where they were defeated by the potential future Prime Minister called Andy Burnham. Everybody's excited, but it tells you two things. First, the Labour Party is still able to win seats despite the economic conditions. So are people upset with them or not, if he can win? And secondly, they are being blamed for the refugee crisis, and people still voted for this man. And this man has some issues. He was accused of being insufficiently sensitive to taking action on the grooming gang scandal. But he, as mayor of Manchester, failed to take decisive action. He, in fact, opposed a national inquiry to start with, and then agreed to a limited inquiry, but one which did not require legal subpoena to be served for everybody to come and give evidence. So he was at the very least somewhat equivocal about this. And the grooming gang scandal is so large that it leaves you breathless. And I don't advise you to read the report. It's 200 pages long. An MP has paid for it privately. A man from another political party, which is more radical, it's 200 pages long, and it is too awful to read. Things which happen to little girls of 12, 13, 11 are simply unbearable to know. And yet they have elected a man who was considered to be insufficiently sensitive towards their plight. And it turns out that the social workers who were responsible for many of these children, because these were children who were living under government care because they were abandoned by parents. So everybody should make note how important parents are, how very important parents are for the welfare of children, and all this nonsense about equity and anybody being able to adopt. This does not work except at the very margin. Only a few adopted parents are worthy of note, but if they fall into the system, these girls are vulnerable. The social workers would sometimes hand them back to the rapists. So did the health services. The police sometimes accused the little girls of being sexually licentious and sent them back. The schools would ban them rather than take action. They were pregnant, being forced to have abortions. Animals were used to violate them. Okay, I will not go further. It is simply an unbearable issue to behold that young women, they are really children, and the whole system failed them. And then the British Labour Party and all its women ministers fought tooth and nail against having a national inquiry. And the current leader of the Labour Party, that is the party general secretary, call it dog whistling. This is a woman saying the entire issue is dog whistling, dismissing it. So if this is not moral collapse, what is? The only reason this has become a big issue is not because of outrage in Britain, though there is outrage, it's because Elon Musk, the richest man in history, has made it an issue. And he keeps funding campaigns and keeps writing in his X about how the people who were responsible directly or indirectly ought to be prosecuted and jailed. So that's why the issue keeps cropping up and is still live. But anyway, this is the moral order of an economy which has nowhere to go. Can it recover? Everything is possible. I cannot rule it out, but it requires many painful choices. And in my personal opinion, the first choice and the prerequisite for doing this is to speak honestly to the electorate and not try to be over smart and tell them stories. They all know things are bad, but be honest with them that we have to pay a price. But you see, they alone cannot be made to pay a price. Unfortunately, what this government has done is to gratify people's popular prejudices by taking foolish actions. For example, they imposed what we call in India the GST. In England, it's the VAT, value added tax, on private schooling. 20% is a big hike in the fee for schooling, which is anywhere between 30 and 80,000 pounds a year. Big numbers. That is, and for day school is not less than 25, but just day school. That is about 30 lakhs. 20% was a big amount. So what happened was those parents which somehow struggle to send their children to private education with their taxed money, they were paying the schooling from their taxed income, couldn't afford it anymore. So say you were a successful plumber, and plumbers do quite well in this country. They're successful. So I'm going to send my child to a private school, or successful electrician, or a senior teacher. They're not very wealthy, but they have moderately okay salaries. They had to leave. They could not afford the extra 20%. Those who are seriously rich, they absorbed the shock. But the irony of this 20% hike was the government said, look here, we're going to raise money from this 20% and improve state schooling, recruit more teachers, make sure the classrooms are smaller. On the contrary, this 20% hike in tax meant that the numbers who had to move to the state sector cost them more than the tax they earn. So the first year, they actually lost 16 million pounds, and this is going to rise to hundreds of millions of additional spending because of this original 20% hike. So this is sheer madness, and the only thing which can explain that is malice at people who are apparently doing better. So that was the first thing. Then they did something which was very foolish from a pragmatic perspective, very foolish. It may have some moral justification. There was a provision in this country called non-doms, that they don't pay British taxes on their foreign income. But very important, they are not taxed on their foreign assets when they die. When you die, the British state imposes a 40% tax on your assets, 40% above £1 million for a couple, approximately £1 million. After that is 40%. Now, dom assets abroad, like say Lakshmi Mittal, their assets abroad, and we're talking about tens of billions, were not subject to inheritance tax. this government brought them into the inheritance tax net. So Britain suffered the biggest single loss of multi-billionaires of any country, followed by China, and then third is India, by the way. But Indians actually mainly go to Dubai to escape taxes. The majority of Indians who have fled abroad are all well, they're coming back now, I think, for reasons that we know. They had gone to Dubai. Now, the government has made it very hard for them to operate their businesses from Dubai because the number of days you can spend in India is actually quite small now. Anyway, be that as it may. So, this tax on non-dom inheritance of assets abroad meant that Lakshmi Mittal went, many other rich people went. They went to Dubai, they went to Switzerland, Portugal, Italy, countries which don't have a serious inheritance tax. Now, that of course meant that the property market at the upper end collapsed, particularly in the wealthier parts of London like Kensington, Knightsbridge, Chelsea. At the upper end really collapsed. That has a cascading effect downstream. So property prices have started collapsing. Now that is a problem because what happened, say you have bought a property for £500,000 and you took a bank loan for 300,000 to buy it. So you have a £300,000 loan of a property of 500. Then you go to renew that loan. The bank won't lend you 300,000 if your property is worth 400. They will lend you 200. So your mortgage renewal becomes a big problem. You've got to find extra cash. So a lot of people are increasingly going to be in trouble when they go to renew their mortgage because the bank will say, oh, your property is worth much less. Your liability cannot be the same anymore. So that's collateral. Does not guarantee the debt that you will incur with us. So this is a cascading effect. Before I forget, let me mention something about taxes. First of all, the inheritance tax of the UK has remained the same since 2010. Despite a rise in inflation of thousands or hundreds of percent, so many more people are caught in the net of inheritance tax, many more people. Because if the level of 2010 had kept rising with inflation, the exemption limit would have risen a lot. The £1 million would have gone up a lot if the exemption limit had kept pace with inflation, static. Then in 2021, the tax exemption brackets, which we have in India, 12.5 lakhs, I believe now, it's actually about the same over here. It's about a little bit more, but India's 12.5 lakh is about £10,000 here. Here it's about £12,500. That has remained static since 2021. So the tax level above 12,500 is 20%. The moment you hit 50,250, it becomes 40%. So a lot of people are now paying 40% tax. Though, if it had kept pace with inflation, their 50,000 would have been at 20%, even at 60,000. So many people who should not be paying 40% are paying 40% because the government has not raised the tax exemption bracket with inflation. Okay, that's bad. So you pay 40% tax. Then you go and spend your money to buy something. You pay another 20% value-added tax of GST. So your tax burden becomes 60%. And then you have to pay council tax, that is for your house, where you live. That is out of your taxed income. You add another 20% tax. So that becomes 80%. These are not discretionary items. These are things you have to pay. You can't escape this 80%. And then the unkindest cut is another part which is not really discretionary. Britain has a very high fuel duty. The tax on fuel is very high. So I would say, off the top of my head, add another 4% tax. So the marginal rate of tax in the UK for anybody earning about 50,000, which is not a big amount at all, not a big amount, is 84%. you get to keep only 16% of your income. So many professionals who are capable of getting work outside trying to leave. In their place are coming young men from Somalia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, West African countries, Syria, all young, able-bodied men who say they're refugees. But where are the women and children who are fleeing trouble? These are all young men of military age. And they are responsible, I'm afraid, for a disproportionate amount of criminality. Particularly men from these cultures, Orthodox Muslim countries, are not accustomed to seeing women who are scantily clothed. And I'm afraid in Europe, women are scantily clothed. I'm not making a moral judgment, but as a fact, and particularly in the summer, people display a lot of flesh, men and women. These young men come from cultures where they are totally unaccustomed to seeing this. This is extremely provocative for them. And in any case, an uncovered woman, in their eyes, is a prostitute. And uncovered women are punished in their countries. It is a crime. So their psychology is such that they arrive here and they find all this that they're seeing visually, and it's a very deadly cocktail. Now, the Pakistani rape gangs, and they are 95% Pakistani. 95% Pakistani. Actually, not just Pakistan, they are disproportionately people from Mirpur. There was a huge Mirpur influxion because of the Bhakra Rangal Canal Dam, which was flooded. A lot of them came. They're Mirpuris. The Home Secretary is a Mirpuri. Mayor of London is a Mirpuri. So it's big trouble for them to say, yes, it is people from my community. Mayor of London has said, no, nothing is happening in London. But the accusation is that he is not being straight, that it has also happened in London. Hotels are being used. And we're talking about, mass scale, and this report by this MP, Lowe, has given chapter and verse. The government inquiry, which will unfold, will take forever, and by then people will have forgotten. This country is a masterful case of inquiries to obscure the truth. Because by the time the inquiry is over, it will be a long time and the events took place. Many, many such inquiries I've seen over many years, they turned out to be a damn squib. Nobody remembers why there was an inquiry. So in a way, Lowe's broadside of 200 pages has brought it back center stage. Now, what will happen with the new Prime Minister, which I think is going to be Andy Burnham, my suspicion? I thought he had two rivals. First of all, they're both further to the left of Starmer in terms of their economic preferences, which means only two things. One, they will raise taxes, and two, they will try to borrow more money. The markets are already spooked, because when Liz Truss borrowed more money, the markets pulled the rug. When she borrowed money without raising taxes, they said the government will default. So the bond market collapsed. So if Burnham and company try to raise money in any serious way, there'll be trouble. Now, hopefully they have learned the lesson of the very recent past. What will happen? Raising taxes is the highest level of taxes in Britain since the Second World War at this moment, the highest level. Partly because of what I described as fiscal drag, the limits not rising with inflation. So that's called fiscal drag. And secondly, they have raised taxes. For example, they impose higher taxes on employers for employing people. So the rate of employment has now jumped to 5%. Many small businesses can't afford to pay the higher tax on employees, which has been imposed. Many small businesses, restaurants, pubs are labor intensive. So their labor costs are a big chunk of their costs. So when this happened, they stopped recruiting. They also raised the minimum wage, which seems to be morally a good thing. But as a result, people are not taking on young people anymore because they can't afford to. So between hard choices, they took the easy choice. And the reason for that, people have not understood. this government has no political authority within its own party. Starmer lost political authority early on, and the new Labour MPs who won the landslide victory in 2024, 250 of them, 224 are people who worked in NGOs or were party activists. So they had no exposure to the real world of economics or work. They ran NGOs, which are predisposed to have this sense of a divide of rich and poor without any mature understanding of the circumstances which allow you to pursue policies. And what I would say from an economic point of view, very simple issue, Britain is a small economy, relatively speaking, compared to the wider world out there. A small economy is a price taker. A small economy is always a price taker. They're not a price maker. They cannot set prices. By virtue of size, it's like the small ice cream seller in the beach. His prices have to adjust to what's in the supermarket. He can't overcharge above the supermarket because he does not set the price. He's a small guy. Britain is like that. Small guy has to adapt to the world economy. They cannot mold the world economy. So their policies cannot behave as if the world economy does not exist, which is what happened with Brexit. Leaving Brexit was exactly that. They thought we'll leave and we'll have new trade deals. Turned out to be totally false, which many people warned them about. And the reason for that was people were upset about everything else in this world. And they were told the Europeans are doing this to you. And the greatest irony of all this, they were angry with foreigners coming here. A lot of foreigners came. But these foreigners were from Poland, Romania, Eastern Europe by and large. They were skilled people who worked, paid taxes. Most of them went back. The Poles went back because the Polish economy is doing better than the British economy. And in their place, there's been a surge of migrants from West Africa and other such countries, people who are not working, people who are on welfare. So they ended up with the worst of both worlds. They did not reduce migration, but they lost skilled people who were paying taxes. So the ruling class, if I may put it colloquially, has basically lost it.
From what I've learned, I think you have spent more than 5 decades in London, and rightfully so. You've provided us with a very passionate, detailed, and insightful, I think, historical context on the situation today, as well as the cascading effects that it has, not only in terms of the economy, but even the moral dilemmas that the people now are faced with, which is an important thing. I do have 2, 3 things there. I think one thing about what you said, electing leaders who have refused inquiries into grooming gangs that have operated in the country. If something of this sort was to happen in India, I think Western countries would be up in arms about human rights violations, and it's quite shocking to see that it has not received equal heat, if not more, than what we would receive if it was happening here. But I also think that's part of another conversation to have.
I think they would have been upset with making a song and dance about something much less important in India. Forget about something as big as this, even for something of insignificance.
Absolutely. Absolutely, which is something that I like to reflect on deeply, and that's also where I feel global order comes in, because when we get to have conversations with experts like you in the field, it really puts these things into perspective. Another thing that you mentioned about Brexit was how the campaign, how the idea was sold to the people of London. And I remember reading about vote to leave campaign that was actively run, and there were certain promises that were made that weren't delivered later. Most of them there were miscalculations about how much the economy would benefit and how much the people would benefit if they shifted out of it. Rightfully so, you have pointed out that Britain is a small economy, which is why it's a price taker, and removing itself from Brexit was a miscalculation on its part, believing that it could be anything other than a price taker. In that context, very briefly, I would like to ask you that there is an understanding from what I've observed among people that Brexit, some people see it as a cause of decline, and others like to see it as a symptom of deeper problems. In the historical context that you traced for us, what would you place Brexit as?
I would say, it is both symptom and cause
Right.
simultaneously. But, Britain trade with Europe was about 40% of 40% of British trade was with Europe. I mean, the idea that you could substitute this with the rest of the world is non-starter. It was not going to happen. But Boris Johnson is a very cynical politician. He wanted to be prime minister, and that's what got him to power. But the original culprit was Prime Minister David Cameron. The reason is to resolve an internal party dispute between the people who wanted to stay in the European Union and a very vocal and important minority which wanted to leave it. He promised a referendum. And this was the beginning of the problem. And my argument from a game theory point of view, you never place a bet on an issue when if you lose, you die. No matter what the odds, if the price of defeat is catastrophe, you don't place such a bet, even if the odds are in your favor, because the consequences are too great. So this is a logic they did not seem to have had. I think they probably believed, oh, we'll win it. And they almost did win it, actually. But there was foreign funding to help the Brexit side. And the people who were the stayers didn't fight a very ineffective campaign. They really didn't. And the great paradox, as with human life everywhere, is that those parts of the UK which voted most vehemently to leave are the ones which have taken the biggest hit from leaving. North, all the deprived areas who were angry and they wanted some, it was very easy to mobilize them by telling them basically grossly exaggerated, inaccurate stories. Scotland didn't want to leave. Northern Ireland didn't want to leave. Wales didn't want to leave. The southeast of England didn't want to leave. It was the combination of votes outside, where people voted to leave. So Brexit became actually the last, the penultimate chapter. And I think COVID, which prompted huge government spending, very foolish levels of government spending, a lot of which was stolen. And this is one very big black mark against Rishi Sunak, because many people made millions out of the COVID funding. For example, anybody who had a trading record for 3 years but had to shut shop because of COVID, no contact, the government paid them all their profits from taxpayer. Now, I have a very successful friend in retail. He said, it was absolutely lovely, Dr. Sen. I was making more money sitting at home watching TV. And then there were a lot of people who supplied medical equipment for Brexit, masks and all sorts of things. I know one guy who first made £10,000 selling masks to the government. His next order was for £750,000, nearly a crore. He had never seen a mask in his life. He placed an order online in China and had it delivered to the NHS hospital at triple the price. And he just collected the proceeds. Some of these contracts were given to family members of Rishi Sunak's own Conservative Party, and this has blown up in their faces. So, there is a kind of moral degradation that in a crisis where people were really suffering. And then Boris Johnson had that infamous party in 10 Downing Street with his colleagues, which is really what destroyed his career in the end. And they showed at the same time a picture of Her Majesty the Queen, who actually was a very loved monarch, sitting alone in church, mourning her husband because she was supposed to be isolated. So they showed a picture of her alone in church, mourning her husband because she was not allowed to be with other people. And then the story of the riotous parties late into the night, going out to the supermarket to buy bottles of wine Rishi Sunak. It's not, sorry, not Sunak, I beg your pardon. I don't know if Sunak was present, but Boris Johnson's team is advisors. So this really went down badly. See, I have to say, after living here for so long, I don't feel schadenfreude that, good, they did so much harm to us. I don't feel that. Ordinary British people have many positive qualities. The ruling class are a bunch of rascals. They're totally cynical, but the ordinary people actually have two things which you cannot deny them. They have a sense of fair play. And if you've lived here for any length of time, you'll notice they have a sense of fair play. And they are more tolerant than most countries in the world, including perhaps even parts of India. They're willing to put up with a lot of nonsense. And you cannot help but feel empathy for their predicament because 60% of people in this country don't have £1,000 buffer in the bank for an emergency. £1,000 buffer they don't have. So that is an indication of how bad things are.
So to sum up, I think what started out as a symptom has now transformed into a cause of decline. And like you did say initially when you were at the beginning of the discussion about how the country has not recorded growth for a long time. So this economic stagnation, if we were to look at it in terms of the extraordinary political turnover that has been observed in the country since 2016, would you?
Prime ministers, seven
Right.
prime ministers.
Exactly. So would you say that this instability is a consequence of the economic stagnation, or is it a part of the reason for it, or both? That would be one question, and I think I would like you also to conclude with uh, your insight on where do you see the country in 20 years? Do you see any hope for the country to be able to renew its economy, or does it look like a country that is in perpetual decline? So that would be, I think, my
This political instability expressed by rapid turnover prime ministers is less likely to happen if the economy is doing well, everybody's feeling happy. So in a way, the political turmoil and the economic crisis are intertwined. The worst part of the story is yet to possibly happen. The City of London, the financial centre, which in my view is historically responsible for Britain's decline. In fact, the great Lord Nicholas Caldor, who was advisor to Harold Wilson in the 1960s, a very renowned Cambridge economist whom I met and I even was offered a job by, he used to say, I don't know why the Germans didn't bomb the Treasury, because he helped the Treasury responsible for Britain's decline. And there was more than a grain of truth in this. Now, the worst part is the City of London generates 1/3 of all taxes in the UK. So it's a very vital part. But after Brexit, they are not allowed to deal in Eurobonds, which were a very large part of their business and profits. They have to have physical presence in Europe to deal with Eurobonds. So all the foreign banks, American and whoever, were here. They said, why do you want to have a presence in London and one in Frankfurt and one in Dublin? So they moved to Dublin and Frankfurt. So this loss of Eurobond trade means that the first time in history, I think it was last year, the French Bourse, the French financial center, had a bigger turnover than London. Now, this decline of London, the principal source of taxes, is a very alarming augury, because what do you do? There'll be riots if you have to cut spending on welfare. Already people are having to choose between heating and eating when it's winter. And there is widespread poverty. Up to 11 million children live in poverty. Things are bad. About 20 million people live in poverty, and this is serious poverty. And I have some direct familiarity. Circumstances have made me fund two of these poor families. So I know exactly what circumstances they live in. So this is a very serious issue. Where will they end up? Let me finish with a historical quote. Hardly anybody will know that Lord Curzon, after he had left India, gave a very interesting lecture in Mumbai in 2008. And he was a very smart man. And he actually said that the Brits in India will cause us to lose the empire because they're so badly behaved towards the natives. He actually said that. But he said something even more interesting and profound. He said, without India, Britain will become an insignificant island off the coast of Europe. And I'm afraid his prediction seems to have been prescient in the extreme. It took a long time, but he actually said that India was the golden goose which kept laying golden eggs again and again. Professor Utsa Patnaik has calculated, and I think, though I disagree with her on most of her politics, she's a serious economist. And she said the total taken from India in the entire period was 45 trillion pounds. That's a serious amount of money. Indeed, she adds, if you look carefully, the British money which went from London to industrialize the United States originated in India. So they're angry with Indians today for being successful, but the American industrialization of the late 19th century was funded by Indian peasants who were squeezed dry. We don't remember our own history. We have been an extraordinary civilization, and I say that without approbation. It had an extraordinary impact, on the outside world. And the people in India who mostly paid for this, and for whom I have boundless sympathy. That's why I had very mixed feelings about the farmers going crazy in Delhi, because they were going crazy. But I have boundless sympathy for farmers, because they carried the can for 800 years, because they were the ones who were being squeezed, and the British squeezed them hardest. The Bengal famine was a result of that, many other famines, because the British taxation prevented farmers from keeping a buffer, which I think is one reason why Indians are obsessed with gold. This is what they bought and hid for a rainy day. Because during the Mughal period, having visible wealth meant that they would come and take it away from you immediately. Whereas gold, you could hide. So our current obsession with gold originates historically. We liked gold, I think, but then it became a survival issue for many families to keep a little bit of gold for times of difficulty. But for Britain, there is neither gold, because the Indian government is taking all its gold back from the Bank of England. I think pretty much all of it is gone. And I don't know what they will do now. I really don't know. At the moment, the politicians only want to be in power, and they will say and do whatever they have to have one-upmanship against the other party. But solving British problems, that is intrinsically difficult, and I don't think they have the caliber. This is a very mediocre bunch of parliamentarians, almost all of them.
From our conversation, I think my takeaway would be that there has been a lot of, while I was researching about the conversation, there was a lot of discussion about how it's been one of the oldest democracies, one of the first nations to industrialize, and it's gone from an empire to a country that is impoverished today, or in the process of it in certain aspects. But I think rather than just being amused by what the status used to be and what it has transformed into today, or devolved into rather, I do believe that, like you have traced the historical context for us, the degradation of the economy as well as the polity has been quite systematic. And that, I think, has a lot of lessons for the countries that are observing it.
Basically, it was loss of empire plus the wars,
Right.
which took Britain off the stage. These were meant, and then, in a way, bad economic policy was partly a product of that background. But some of it was worse than it need have been, some of the policy making.
Understood. Thank you so much, sir, for joining for the conversation. It's late at night for you in London, and
No, it's not.
sorry,
It's actually
it's
for
afternoon
you.
for you. It's late at night for me. I've been
Yes.
confusing these two things. But thank you so much for joining. I think as somebody just starting out here, there's a lot that I learned today, especially from the long span where you spoke for. There was quite a lot that I put down and learned for myself. So thank you for joining today, the Global Order, and we look forward to more such insightful conversations with you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.